In April 1943, two American generals traveled from China to Washington. They had the same goal: to drive Japan out of China. But very different agendas. General Claire Chennault wanted more planes. General Joseph Stilwell wanted equipment for the infantry. Only one man could decide what to do: U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt.
He invited both Chennault and Stilwell to come to the White House, the only time he saw both of them together. And he asked Stilwell, what did he think of Chiang Kai-shek? And Stilwell said, he's an ignorant peasant bastard who never keeps his word and who's worthless as an ally. And a few hours later, he asked Chennault, what do you think of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek? And Chennault said, he's one of the greatest leaders in the 20th century, whom we should back without hesitation. And after that, it was a no-brainer. As George Marshall said, Chennault wanted what Chiang wanted. Roosevelt wanted what Chiang wanted. It was a no-brainer to give aid to Chennault. Did it make any military sense? Of course not. Did it make political sense? Absolutely.
Chennault, formerly the commander of the American Volunteer Group, now had bigger fish to fry. The time for defense was over. As commander of the 14th Air Force, he could at last go on the offensive. Allied air bases became launch pads for attacks against the Japanese in central China. Picturesque Guilin roared with the arrival of the American Air Force. A karst cave near Yangtang Airfield, once Chennault's own headquarters, became the HQ for the American Air Force in China. The fate of China hung in the balance. Whoever controlled the air would win the war. Driving the Americans from the sky was Japan's top priority. From July 1943, the numerically superior Japanese Air Force carried out a series of large-scale attacks. A desperate fight for the air supremacy of China took place in the sky of central China. During the combats, the ratio of American planes to Japanese planes was usually 1-3, sometimes even 1-5. The fight was unprecedentedly fierce, lasting for 8 days and 8 nights. 62 Japanese fighters were confirmed as shot down, with another 46 probables, with the loss of just 3 American pilots and 6 planes. Even when an American plane was shot down, there was a good chance that the pilot would survive. American pilots wore blood chits on their backs. Written in Chinese, they informed the readers that the pilot was a friend of China. Posters were put up both in nationalist-held areas and were secretly circulated in Japanese-occupied areas. Huge rewards were offered to those who helped an American airman get back to base. Trained pilots were more valuable than planes. Rescuing a flyer from a Japanese-occupied area carried a reward of $100,000 US, around $2 million in today's currency. Even expenses incurred escorting the American pilots back were reimbursed by the Chinese government.
We're always told that if we as Americans were shot down and rescued, anything we told whoever rescued us, remember, because the government would back us up.
Few Chinese knew about such an astronomical reward, but they did know that these foreigners falling from sky were fighting for China, so of course, they should help them. John R. Allison was one of the American pilots who benefited from Chinese care. Allison was the most skilled of all Chennault's pilots. He had an amazing record and amazing luck. On one occasion, Allison commanded a fighter escort covering a bomber mission to Ichang. They were met by 20 Japanese defenders. The odds were not good. Allison had only 9 fighters. Undaunted, the Americans were swift to attack. Allison's P-40 dashed into the Japanese formation. He immediately shot down 2 enemy aircraft. A Japanese fighter attempted to attack the B-24 fleet. Allison bravely engaged in battle for a 3rd time. As he climbed toward the enemy, his rudder was destroyed by gunfire. Unable to turn, he could only fly in a straight line. A Japanese fighter got on his tail. He was in grave danger. Luckily, a Chinese pilot came to his rescue. Allison escaped and nursed his damaged plane back to base. It wasn't his only narrow escape. On a hot summer night in South China, 3 Japanese bombers attacked Hengyang. Allison and another pilot attempted to cut them off. They had only bush radar and moonlight to guide them to the enemy planes. Allison climbed and intercepted the Japanese bombers before they could drop their bombs. First, he attacked the Japanese bomber on the left. It was damaged and fled. Then Allison turned to the second bomber that was hitting him. He blew it up and became the first American pilot to shoot down a Japanese plane at night over China. However, Allison's plane was also damaged. He didn't give up, but kept fighting. He locked on to a 3rd bomber and destroyed it. It took just 1 minute to shoot down the 3 enemy planes. Allison kept flying, but was unable to make it back to base. He had to make a forced landing. He made a soft landing on the Shanjiang River. As the dazed pilot struggled toward the riverbank, a Chinese boy on a log raft fished him out of the water and took him to safety. Once again, Allison survived. In a final twist of fate, 20 years later, Allison was introduced to a young employee of his company. The man was named Ching. They had met before. Ching was the boy who pulled Allison from the river. In the fall of 1943, the Air Force in China was again reorganized. A new crew, the CACW, the Chinese-American Composite Wing, was a direct descendant of the American Volunteer Group. Now, for the first time, Chinese and American pilots would fly together in a single unit. The first batch of Chinese cadets arrived at Thunderbird Air Force Base in Phoenix, Arizona, back in March 1942.
我们是初级班、中级班、高级班的话呢，一共大概是8个月，8个月，以后呢有3个月的部队训练，3个部队训练，这所谓这个部队训练的话呢，就是实战作业，就是真正的我们这个开始是驾驶这个所谓这个鲨鱼式的那个飞机。
The Chinese-American Composite Wing, a division of the U.S. 14th Air Force, became operational on October 1, 1943. The majority of its members were Chinese pilots trained in the United States. Only a quarter of the CACW were Americans. The unit had a joint command structure.
我们大队长，他有大队长；我们中队长，他有中队长；他有分队长，我们也有分队长。这样都是一起的，在一起混合，一起出任务，一起回来。
The commander of the CACW was Colonel Winslow Morris from the USA, and deputy commander was Zhang Weifu from the ROC. Together, the officers from both sides coordinated every mission. Although the CACW was officially part of China's Air Force, it was under the command of General Chennault's U.S. 14th Air Force.
我跟一个美国人到汉口打完了火车站以后啊，就回来了。回来以后呢，都是有人在云里飞，因为飞机这个那时候战斗机啊，设备不是说很好的了，在云里飞呀，就是那个看那个小飞机啊，这飞呀，那个我们来在云里飞，飞来飞去啊，找不到机场，飞来飞去飞到最后呢，两个人不约而同的，我没通知他，他也没通知我，我们就跳伞了，没油了吗？跳伞了以后，结果当地老百姓啊，以为是我们天兵天将的，他说他没这个知识啊，他以为是天兵天将来了，哎，所以呢，当地老百姓抬着花杆送我下山，那个山很窄，山坡滑的，铁冰的，这一滑一滑，掉了山涧就完了就，所以呢，那个真是怪，真是。
103-year-old Xuanyan Li joined China's Air Force in 1932. After training in the U.S., he was made leader of the 1st Bomber Group of the Combined Wing and took part in one of its most famous actions.
我们用炸身就是14架飞机，15架飞机掩护，15架驱逐机掩护。因为日本人这个行政，他这个主要这个在台湾这基地。
The attack on Hsinchu Air Base was a brave but risky action by the 14th Air Force. On November 25, 1943, the Americans' traditional Thanksgiving Day, 30 U.S. aircraft took off from the secret airfield in Jiangxi. The Japanese were shocked when the planes appeared in formation above their airbase. They couldn't believe that there were American planes soaring overhead. More than 70 Japanese planes were destroyed on the ground, and 12 were shot down in the air. All the American planes returned home safely. Tex Hill, commander of the 23rd Fighter Group, was in charge of this almost perfect battle, flying his new P-51. Hill downed a Japanese aircraft, becoming the first P-51 Mustang pilot to destroy a Japanese plane in the China theater. Although Japan started the year with more planes than the Americans, the tide had changed. With each battle, the Americans grew stronger and the Japanese weaker. As Takushiro Hattori, head of the operations section of the Army General Staff, later wrote, "Before 1942, we had the supremacy in the air with an absolute advantage, but then it became the complete opposite." The shock of the successful long-range attack on Hsinchu worried the Japanese High Command. They worried that if the Americans could reach Taiwan, they would soon be able to reach their homeland. In January 1944, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters launched Operation Ichigo. If successful, it would change the course of the war. It was the largest Japanese ground offensive in the war. The goal was to knock out Chinese and American air bases in China. The Japanese made a huge deployment. Its 5th Air Army in China also joined the battle, but its effectiveness was compromised. By this time, it could only put 84 fighters in the air. That was less than the number of planes the AVG had back in 1941. Yet now they faced both the 14th U.S. and Chinese Air Forces. From April through November, the Japanese won a string of victories on the ground, forcing the Nationalist Army to retreat. The Japanese Army successfully captured a string of Allied air bases, forcing the flyers to retreat. To stop them falling into enemy hands, the Americans destroyed their runways, barracks, and other facilities as they withdrew. They buried explosives beneath the runways and blew giant craters in them, and they destroyed everything that could not be taken away. In 1944, Richard Hill was assigned to China on a mission to organize and operate a secret escape network for Allied pilots whose airplanes were shot down behind enemy lines. With the help of Chinese people, Hill had saved 46 Allied pilots over 3 months. Glen Benita was one of them. Zhoulazhe town in Hubei province was once the capital of the ancient Rongcheng state. During the Second Revolutionary Civil War, it was the red capital of Western Hunan and Western Hubei Revolutionary Base area. In May 1944, Glen Benita was flying a fighter escort on a bombing mission. Benita was forced to bail out when his plane was hit by enemy fire. 90-year-old Luo Zheshi picks up the tale.
我们就跟他说了，我们也不管他懂不懂是吧？你不要怕，绝对不能伤害你是吧？他不懂的，你说他了，他能懂的是吧？我们都是摆手的，你不要怕，不要怕。我把火烧熟的，叫他吃啊，他不肯吃了，不吃我还是吃的，拿筷子他拿不好，我们告他摆的筷子，我们说我们先吃，怕他说我们有头是吧？我们先吃，他那个搞好，他说。把他的东西一收出来，然后说我们吃一个叉子，一个抓钩，像那个我们的用的抓钩是吧？
Benita was shot down so far from his base that the villagers couldn't get him there on their own. Instead, they took him to the new 4th Army. For 60 days, Benita was looked after by the new 4th Army. When he regained his strength, they escorted him back to the U.S. base. Benita carried with him a gift for General Chennault. Li Shenyan, commander of the 5th Division, had him deliver a captured Japanese sword. In 2005, Benita came back to the county with his wife and children. In Lojachun village, he reunited with the local villagers who saved his life over half a century ago. In 2010, 86-year-old Benita came back to China for the last time. Shortly after the visit, he passed away. To fulfill his final wish, his ashes were buried in China. For many Chinese people, flying tigers are heroes. But in the eyes of Benita, the Chinese people were true heroes. As he said, it's Chinese people who gave him life. Not every pilot was as lucky as Benita. On August 31st, 1944, a B-24 bomber pilot took off to bomb the Japanese battleships anchored in a port in Taiwan. On his return, his own base was itself under attack, so he was forced to divert to another airfield. He never made it. In 1996, villagers Pan Chi-bin and Jiang Jun went to pick herbs. They found much, much more. Near the peak of Mauer Mountain, they found debris from a crashed plane. It was the first time it was seen in 50 years. The county museum investigated the crash site 3 times. The team found machine guns, pistols, an oxygen tank, electronic instruments, and the identification tags of 5 airmen. They confirmed that it was the plane lost over 50 years ago. The investigators speculated that flying over unfamiliar terrain in darkness and thick fog made the bomber lose direction and slam into the main peak of the mountain. Following the discovery, the Xing'an County Museum has made several trips to the mountain in attempts to locate the aviators' bodies. The terrain was so dangerous that every trip is itself life-threatening.
有些我们下去的时候，有些要搞个绳子载着下去，有些在悬崖上面，这里长了一棵大树，树枝在这个悬崖上面，我们要抓到那个悬崖，然后一个脚踩在这个树枝上面，然后从树再下去，是这样的，因为不是很危险的，很危险的啊！我们没有当时也没有想发财，也没有想什么新冠，就是想到，哎呀，这外国人帮助我们中国人抗日，牺牲在这里这么多年都不知道，大家都不知道他，现在我们发现了，我们也就是当地老百姓很不惜那些姚明啊，我们也是有义务要把他们清理出来，把他们送回去给他们。
1997 witnessed a handover ceremony of the aircrew's remains held by China and the U.S. in Xing'an County. After more than 50 years in the mountain wilderness, these American soldiers who traveled thousands of miles to help China fight the Japanese were at last reunited with their families. The oldest among them was 29 years old, the youngest 19. Success on the ground meant that the Japanese held several vital airfields. They thought that this would turn the tide in China's sky back to their favor. They were wrong. Despite their retreat from the airfields, the 14th Air Force never reduced its attacks on the enemy.
见什么打什么，看见日本运输车呀、运兵呀，我们就下去打，把那个卡车都打烧了。船照打，它也都是运补的嘛，我们也把它打烧了。
Tens of thousands of Chinese flattened their farmlands and built airfields day and night. Some of the airfields were established very close to the Japanese-held territory. The Japanese destroyed these airfields whenever they found them. However, as soon as the Japanese army left, the Chinese people immediately repaired the damaged airfields. Only a few days later, the U.S. airplanes could again take off from these airfields that the Japanese thought were destroyed. It's fair to say that the U.S. planes take off from and land on the hands of the Chinese people. After the war, Chennault wrote with gratitude in his autobiography that the biggest contribution of the Chinese to the 14th Air Force was airfield construction. No matter how many airfields were occupied by the Japanese forces, they could still conduct the missions. It seemed that the Chinese could rapidly build airfields everywhere. Therefore, the 14th Air Force was like Hydra. Whenever one airfield was destroyed by the Japanese, another two would be born. Chennault was not content with sporadic bombing. At the end of 1944, he and the 20th Air Force Commander General Curtis LeMay planned an unprecedented air raid. The 20th Air Force was created in order to bomb the Japanese home islands from China. Beginning in April 1944, over 100 of the Americans' most powerful planes, B-29 Superfortress bombers, were stationed in China. At that time, the B-29 was the most advanced bomber in the world, with extraordinary flight range, bomb load, and a self-defense capability that enabled it to carry out missions without escort. On December 18th, 17 B-29s took off from Chengdu. They were headed for Hankou Airfield, Japan's biggest base in central China. Before Japanese fighters could take off, bombs rained on the targeted airfields, docks, and warehouses. When the last B-29 left, Hankou was shrouded by dense smoke. An hour later, 200 planes of the 14th Air Force took off from different airfields for the second wave of attack. The fighters had dogfights with the Japanese, who were still reeling from the previous raid. It was the biggest air raid in China. Oil stocks and barracks were destroyed. The fires at Hankou wharfs burned for 8 days and railways were paralyzed. With complete mastery of the sky, the U.S. Air Force downed or damaged the 64 Japanese planes without any loss of their own. The next day, Chennault told journalists that this successful air raid showed that the Japanese had completely lost control of the air over China, and that the American and Chinese air forces now dominated China's sky. (1944) was the 7th year Chennault had been in China. He was already 54 years old. Under his leadership, Apache mercenary contingent, somewhat like Robin Hood in medieval England, had developed into a regular Air Force unit on a large scale with extraordinary combat records. While Chennault was devising new ways to fight the Japanese, the unexpected happened. A 19-year-old Chinese graduate came into his life.
The first time I met him, it was in a press conference with many other reporters. I was the only woman. And but I was a little bit nervous. I mean, naturally, but I think he sort of put everybody at ease, and then he saw me and he said, you know, he knew my father. My father was the Chinese Consul General in California. So even for the first time, I was impressed by his, should I say, determination. I mean, I think any woman would love a strong man with decision, and I think that's the character, that's the impressions I have of him.
At that time, Anna Chen Xiangmei was a reporter working for the Kunming branch of the Central News Agency. For a 19-year-old girl, it can be a small step from hero worship to the start of a love affair. In the beginning, Chennault treated Anna as an elder. But as they got to know each other better, his feelings for the active and clever Chinese woman changed. Before long, his men discovered that whenever this Chinese reporter was around, a smile always hovered round their grave commander's lips.
It was not that easy for meeting each other all the time, but I did think about it at that time. I was very young, and I was just out from college and just doing my job. And at that time, I knew he was a married man, and later on, before he departed from China to the States, he told me he was going to get a divorce, and so he seemed to be very determined. Once he made up his mind what to do, just go for it, go for it.
But before this controversial love affair could bear fruit, Chennault had a mission to accomplish. By early 1945, the 14th Air Force controlled China's sky. It had grown to over 500 fighters, over 100 bombers, and over 30,000 personnel, not including the B-29s on the advanced bases and the planes of Chinese Air Force. They completely outstripped the Japanese Air Force in terms of quantity and quality. For Japan, the writing was on the wall. Chinese people were responsible for logistic service for the numerous American soldiers fighting in China. They cooked, washed clothes, cleaned houses, repaired airfields, transported ammunition, and constructed buildings. Providing food for the Americans was a big challenge for a population who were themselves suffering from extreme scarcity. It was said that Americans ate more meat in a single meal than a Chinese family ate in a year. And every American would eat 2 or 3 eggs every morning.
你提供给美国人的物资要比提供给普通的中国部队，要多丰富多了啊！它主要是有很多牛肉啊、猪肉啊、鸡蛋啊这些给云南的政府，老百姓压力很大。但是云南人都毫无怨言，去提供给他们。
Although Yunnan Province and Sichuan Province were rear areas during the war, people there made enormous contributions and sacrifice as well. In their mind, those Americans who came all the way to help them fight the Japanese were real heroes. In 2005, some of the last surviving flying tigers attended a reunion in China. A Chinese veteran told a harrowing story.
He said, I saw the flying tiger was shouting down, and I found him. I put them under the tunnel when the Japanese was searching for him. But in the tunnel, there is a lady with a small baby and kept crying. You know, if the crying, and Japanese may find it. So the lady, in order to save the life of flying tiger, and she tightly covered the baby's mouth. And until then, when the Japanese left, and she found out her baby died. When this happened, when they talk about this, you know, everybody feels heartbroken. And the American flying tigers all stood up, salute to the veteran, and Chinese veterans still salute back. They hold each other. I saw they were held tightly with the tears in the eyes.
Chinese support came in many ways. Chennault once received a letter containing a map and 20,000 Chinese cash. The sender wanted the money handed to the first pilot to bomb the Japanese occupying his hometown. His letter said, "You may drop bombs on my house, but be careful. Do not hurt my neighbors. Please take your operations during the Spring Festival, because I do not want the Japs to enjoy the festival." Chennault's men did not let that refugee down. The air raid was followed by more frequent bombing operations. With Japanese planes largely swept from China's skies, the fighters of the 14th Air Force were increasingly used in ground operations. Destruction of rail lines hindered Japanese troop movements, and movements on the Yangtze River were almost paralyzed.
We had 3 missions in China. Well, actually only 2, but one of them was support the ground troops with strafing and bombing the Japanese. The second was to harass the Japanese shipping, either from the northern Yangtze River or the South China Seas. And this was our basic role in it.
Lieutenant General Sato Yamashita, the Supreme Commander of the Japan Air Force in China, helplessly admitted that the enemy's air force was so active that they could hardly use the transport lines and were forced to march on foot. On April 14, 1944, Ho Ying-chin, Minister of Military and Chief of the General Staff of the Chinese Army, approved the West Yunnan Offensive Operation. The Chinese Expeditionary Force launched this counterattack. Tengchong was the biggest stronghold of the Japanese Army along the western bank of Nujiang River. The Nationalist Army fought fiercely to recapture the place. Chennault's 14th Air Force assisted the Army by heavily bombing the front line of the Japanese Army.
The 城中的情啊，很不好打。中国军队死了好多人，我们就去摧毁那个围墙。 就炸，还炸他那个堡垒，他堡垒多得不得了，一个，我们就去炸，炸完就走，不希望带好几，一去在起码3架到5架飞机上，炸完就回来第2架呢，我去了3次。
Even with the help of the Air Force, it took 3 months and over 40 battles for the Chinese Army to recapture Tengchong. Cooperation between the Army and the Air Force enabled the Chinese to retake a string of Japanese strongholds. Thus, After 2 years of occupation, the Japanese army was finally kicked out, and China's Southwest Gateway was at last secured. In this campaign, the Chinese army suffered over 60,000 casualties. 14 American pilots and members of the Army Advisory Group also lost their lives. On January 27, 1945, the Chinese Expeditionary Force and the Chinese Army in India were reunited. From then on, military supplies could flow into China both by air, over the hump, and by road. Beginning in early 1945, the coordinated counterattack by the Chinese Army and the American Air Force pushed the Japanese back. By June, there were barely any Japanese planes in China's sky. Fighting against Japanese aircraft became so rare that both American and Chinese pilots actively prayed for combat.
那时候是没有空战了，已经。我回国以后没有空战了，就是取得了这个中国战场的制空权。是不是？这个打的没有了嘛？ 我们到韩国，那韩国我到韩国机场看了，2、3架飞机摆着日本飞机啊，就摆机上不敢动了。我们去了以后扫射一下，根本也就报废了已经。
By June 1945, news of the German surrender and the end of the war in Europe spread through China. The days to Japan's defeat were numbered. George Marshall, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Force, Never Chennault's keenest supporters, were unwilling to let him stay in China to enjoy the fruits of victory. With the end of the war in sight, Chennault was removed from China and forced to resign.
In the summer of 1945, after Roosevelt passed away, he didn't have any champion left here in the United States. So they came in and they were, easily asked him to retire again, forced him to retire again. So again, he took another health retirement in the summer, just weeks before the bombs were dropped and the war was over.
For a veteran, nothing was more heartbreaking than leaving the battlefield on the eve of the victory. On July 16th, the Central Daily News ran an editorial titled, "Farewell to General Chennault." There was no parallel in history for a nationalist government newspaper to run an editorial specifically for a foreigner leaving China. On July 30th, Chiang Kai-shek held an investiture for Chennault in his official mansion in Chongqing. China's highest military honor, the Order of Blue Sky and White Sun, was awarded to General Claire Chennault by the Commander-in-Chief of the Chinese theater himself, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. August 8th was an important day. Japan was already reeling from the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The Soviet Union had just declared war on Japan, and Claire Chennault departed Kunming for his homeland. He took off from the former Kunming airfield, site of some of the Flying Tiger's earliest victories. Recently, It had been rechristened Chennault Airfield. On August 11th, 2 days after the Nagasaki bomb, the 14th Air Force stopped all combat missions. Technically, the war in the air stopped before the official Japanese surrender. Yet the order to stop air operations came not from General Chennault, who had worked tirelessly for China since 1937, but from General George Stratemeyer, the newly installed Supreme Commander of the U.S. Air Force in China. Chennault heard the news of Japan's unconditional surrender on an airplane heading for the United States via Europe.
He was not even asked to be on the Missouri when the peace treaty was signed. And what a disgrace to him, and what a hard thing for him.
The end of the war brought other changes as well. Soon, the brilliant military exploits of the Chinese-American Composite Wing would also be consigned to history. However, they had one last engagement before they disbanded. On August 21st, 1945, Takeo Imai, the Japanese Deputy Chief of Staff in China, and the representative of Yasuji Okamura, Japanese General Commander in China, flew to Zhejiang to finalize Japan's surrender. The ceremony was held in a barrack of the 5th Fighter Group of the CACW. After carefully reading the Japanese surrender memorandum prepared by the Chinese, Takeo Imai signed and sealed the memorandum. After the ceremony, Ho Ying-chin, commander of the Nationalist Army, and representatives of both China and the United States had a group photo taken. They had every reason to enjoy the moment after 8 years of bloody battles. Chennault did not stay in the U.S. for long. 6 months later, he was back in China and created his own civil aviation company. Never politically astute, he soon fell foul of the new political realities. Initially, he was engaged to transporting military supplies to Chiang Kai-shek in the Civil War. Later, he was involved in the legal proceedings with the government of the People's Republic of China over 71 airplanes detained in Hong Kong. On the mainland, these events tarnished the good reputation previously built up as General of the Flying Tigers. When severe illness caused Chennault to be hospitalized in his later years, his forever princess, Madame Chang, visited him in the hospital. She still called him General, just as she had done in China since 1937. Chennault died on July 27, 1958. 9 days before his death, he was promoted to Lieutenant General by President Eisenhower. His funeral ceremony was held in the Arlington National Cemetery in Washington. Tomb of General Chennault was carved in Chinese on the back of his tombstone. It is the only tombstone with Chinese characters in Arlington National Cemetery. In 1960, a bronze statue of Chennault was erected in Taipei. Madame Chang and Chen Changmei attended the unveiling ceremony. Chennault's ties with the mainland remained fractured until long after his death. In 1981, his wife Anna visited China on a special envoy of President Reagan. Deng Xiaoping met with a delegation headed by Anna Chennault in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. During their talk, Deng Xiaoping spoke highly of General Chennault and his flying tigers. This was the first time since 1949 that a Chinese official positively acknowledged Chennault's contribution to the anti-Japanese war.
保国怀壮志，正好乘风飞去。那时候就是那种心情啊，长空万里对日本的，负我救河山，非要把日本人给打回去不行。那时候真是那种心情。
我加了空军呢，32年，30年我才想开始飞行。你想想看，30年才想开始飞行，一直到现在，我还活着，能够活着，已经很好了。我很满意，我的一生对得起国家。
Over 2,000 American airmen lost their lives in China. Some of these young lives disappeared in China's sky. Some fell onto the ground of China. Some sank into rivers and lakes. They all had one name integrating strength and courage: the Flying Tigers.